Hello and welcome to episode 3 of You Love Us. Today we look at the aftermath of Richey's disappearance and the rebirth of the band with the album Everything Must Go. We left episode 2 with the disappearance of Richey, that awful occurrence that broke the four friends from Blackwood. You know, they'd been a group for so many years, and then inexplicably one morning they wake to find that they are three. We all lose friends and family, sometimes too regularly, sometimes too young. But we hope we know what's happened to them. We hope we know why we've lost them. And this uncertainty that hung over the band and Richey's family and the fans was such a destructive thing. It wasn't helped by the UK press. You know, the UK press are the vultures at the best of times, particularly the tabloids. The tabloids in this country are... well, they're just sensationalists, and it's they're like the Sun and the Daily Mirror. You know, they didn't focus on Richey as a person. They didn't focus on the band. They focused on stories about mental illness and self-harm, the more lurid aspects. You know, they'd go back to the for real and use that picture over and over again. But that tried to simplify who Richey was. Richey wasn't just, a damaged soul. He wasn't just an image of self-harm. He was 1/4 of a very, very important band, and he just so happened to be the 1/4 that was very, very influential in how they looked, what they said, how they were perceived. And to lose that overnight, not only the loss of the friend, of the brother, but the loss of the image overnight must have been so confusing. And, we saw then for a period of about 6 months where the Manics, quite rightly so, did next to nothing, no public appearances, the odd rehearsal, but nothing, because how do you take that hurt, that pain, that uncertainty, and how do you in the midst of that turn it into something positive and creative? I certainly couldn't. I don't know how to do it. I wouldn't know how to do it, and I hope I never find myself in that situation. The music papers were a little bit kinder. NME, February 11th, 1995, said it's too soon for obituaries. The Manics haven't announced the split. Richey could still walk through the door tomorrow. Until then, we wait. And I think that's quite a nice, hopeful look at it, But Nicky reflected years later, looking back at how the media covered Richey's disappearance, and said that they tried to turn him into a poster boy for madness, We knew Richey better than that, but suddenly everybody was an expert on him. They were trying to oversimplify him. They were trying to make him an image for desolation, for depression, for mental health, for self-destruction, and he was so much more than that. It must have been the worst of times for them. James Dean Bradfield reflected that we were catatonic. It was impossible to think straight. It was one of those moments where everything goes into slow motion and you're operating on autopilot. And that is at times said about all grief. When people suffer from grief, they go into the natural modes. But this is a band, a group of friends who had been through, the trials and tribulations of forming a band, of creating an image, of creating a sound, of creating a tone. And they would be stronger than this, Nicky said we couldn't just end. Richey wouldn't have wanted that. Richie had told us in no uncertain terms that the band must carry on no matter what. And I think that was backed up that Richie had left behind a folder of lyrics before his disappearance. Whether that was on purpose, whether he'd done that to leave a legacy, or nobody knows, but it was dubbed the Book of Richie, and the band would selectively, in 2009, use some of those lyrics for Journal of Plagued Lovers, which we'll get to in a couple of episodes' time. This was a real turning point for the band. You know, that they'd set out with the punk ethos. They destroy, love, beautiful, ugly. You know, they'd had all those dichotomies, those contradictions within the music. They'd wanted to make their 18 million sales and disappear and burn out. You know, they'd had all that, but this was a turning point. This is where they could they be a three-piece effectively? Could they play the songs that they'd played historically as a three-piece? But more importantly, could they write new songs that would be loved by the Manic's fans and identified as Manic songs? This was a moment for reflection and evolution. You know, they could have quite easily gone to be a three-piece that repeated Generation Terrorist, that repeated Gold Against the Soul. That would have been the easy option for them at that point. And I don't think if that had been their next album, I don't think anybody would blame them. I don't think they would have lost fans. I don't think they would have been overly criticised by the critics, not that what they say matters. And I still think they would have had successful tours. But they didn't do that. They took this opportunity to review what was important to them. That they took that moment of reflection. And this is when later in 1995 they start to do some rehearsals, and then they start to do some recording. And instead of doing the old and being safe, they went for something new and sought redemption. They sought not a closure, but an honouring of the first three albums. And they said, this is not Manic Street Preachers Part 2 or Version 2. This is Manic Street Preachers Version 1 with love. They went off and they wrote Everything Must Go, and you cannot overstate the importance of this album. Not just to the band, you know, obviously it was very, very important to the band, but to the fans and to the legacy of Richie. You know, this album came out of nowhere. Let's be honest about it. You know, if we look at Generation Terrorist, Gold Against Soul, then the Holy Bible, if we look at that arch of where the band was going at that point, Everything Must Go came out of nowhere, and it was like it might sound a bit glorious, but it was like this phoenix, you know, rising from the ashes. The sound had changed, but was still the Manics. The lyrics had changed, but was still the Manics. The look had changed, but it was still the Manics. And this is where they were at this tipping point of keeping Richie's spirit and memory alive whilst going into a new era of massive commercial success. And yeah, that's why this album is so important. It allowed them the opportunity to perform again, to write again, to look at where they were with the Holy Bible. The Holy Bible was, you know, for some people it's a difficult listen, but Everything Must Go was joyous. It was an album. It was an album about evolution. Yeah, I think James said it best, and he said that there was no master plan. We just wanted to stay alive and make that record, and making that record did that. So throughout late 95, the band would get together and look at what they had. They had some lyrics left over from Richey, obviously. They had some songs that they had, demos that they had done in the weeks leading up to Richey's disappearance. But it was this opportunity to say, what are we going to write now? What are we going to do? And it started with a line that Nicky had given to James, and it was, libraries gave us power. And James said that something just clicked. It felt righteous. And they went off, and as a threesome, recovering from the trauma of the last 6, 7, 8 months, they wrote a Design for Life. For me, personally, my favourite song of all time. Not just by the Manics, by any artist of any era, of any genre. Design for Life is a song about rebirth. It's a song about pride. It's about defiance. It's about intelligence. It's a truly amazing song. I wasn't very well at the time that came out in, what was it, April 96. And it was that song that, it sounds very, very dramatic, but it was that song that pulled me out of that. It was that song that said to me it was okay to feel how I was feeling and to be the person I needed to be, and that it was okay to aspire to be better. That song was everything to me at that moment in my life, and I had no idea that the band would then go and write a whole album which was full of a Design for Life, so that the album that they would come back with would change the course for the band completely, and change it would bring so many new fans to the band. That's one of the most amazing things, that it gave them that commercial success that they deserved. They'd had the critical success, they were critics' darlings at points, but it was the commercial success that the four of them deserved, that the three of them received. They are such talented musicians, whether it be, I don't know, guitar, bass, drums, a bit of trumpet, or whatever it is they're playing. They're all very, very talented, and they gel so well. And I think that this is where you hear that truly for the first time. And I know people will go, yeah, they were match fit, or they were extremely tight on the Holy Bible. Yeah, they were. There's no denying that the Holy Bible is a band at their peak for that time, but there's something different in Everything Must Go. It's almost like they've got a point to prove, and to the record label, they did. The Holy Bible did not sell well. They were in debt to the record label. They had to produce something which gave them something back. But who would have thought that one album would turn them into, well, global stars? It's impossible to overstate the importance of this album. Whether it be, the album came out in May of 96, and we would sit down, and as fans, we would put it into our CD players or onto our vinyl decks, and we'd be greeted with the seaside sounds of Elvis Impersonator. And then as that Rickenbacker 12-string guitar starts coming in, we're thinking, this feels familiar, this feels nice, and then James's vocals. But it's when the band kicks in and they all come in together, and then that track finishes and Design for Life comes in, and you just think, oh my God. it can't get any better than this. And for me, it hasn't. Design for Life is the absolute pinnacle of the Manics. Lots of tracks have come fairly close, but for me personally, Design for Life is the absolute pinnacle of them. Everything Must Go came from Nicky's brother had that title with a photograph. Was it going to be a play? Was it going to be something he did? Who knows? But James took an instant liking to that as a name for an album. You listen to the Be My Baby drums, doom, 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 at the start of Everything Must Go, and you just think, oh, this is just pulling me up and pulling me up, and it's making me feel that the Manics are here to stay, that I don't have to rely on the first 3 albums, that there is a fourth, that there's going to be a fifth, and it's going to keep on going and keep on going, and it was a great feeling as a fan. Here's James talking about Everything Must Go.
But when you give me the lyric, obviously we're talking to ourselves and we're talking to our audience. We're saying, look, something, we're amidst something, traumatic and big here, but we need to move on for now, whilst showing that we don't forget. We're still here, the same guys. We're still using some of Richey's words. He's still with us. The space is still on the stage there. But we've got to move on for now. Let's see how this goes. Literally, that's what the song is saying. Yeah. And it's asking for a bit of forgiveness if people feel upset about us carrying on, I suppose.
James said something interesting there, that the song was asking for forgiveness to some degree. And as a fan, you can understand that, because we don't have our favourite children, but we have our favourite footballer, or we have our favourite musician. And to some fans, Richey was the Manics, and him not being there anymore, but them going on, may well have been seen to them as, a problem. But Everything Must Go sums that up, that everything we have in life must go. It does. And it didn't, the band didn't diminish Richey or Richey's input or Richey's legacy. They didn't brush him to one side. They didn't say forget about him. They produced an album which would use Richey's lyrics to phenomenal effect. The tracks Kevin Carter, Small Black Flowers, and Elvis Impersonator Blackboard Pier are Richey's lyrics. Richey is still there. He might not be standing next to them. He might not be part of the tour, the press conference, but his impact is still there to be felt by the band, by the fans, and that's a wonderful thing. The Manics talked about, should we change our name? No, we couldn't do that. Could we stop? No, they were scared of stopping. That's what Nicky said. We couldn't, because we were scared of stopping. So let's have a look at the critical and commercial reaction to Everything Must Go. So NME 9 out of 10. This is not a betrayal of the past. It's beautiful, bruised tribute to it. An album soaked in both loss and resolve. Q Magazine 5 out of 5. A towering, life-affirming record, emotional but never sentimental. An elegy that refuses to die. The Guardian, few albums manage to mourn and celebrate at once. Everything Must Go does both. The critics got it right for a change. Well done. It peaked at number 1. It peaked at number 1. You can't get any higher than number 1. It went number 1. 1.5 million copies sold. That's just in the UK. That is success. Mainstream success. Like I said, this is exactly what the band deserved. It stayed in the UK charts for 102 weeks. 102 weeks. Phenomenal. 4 singles off it. Design for Life, which reached number 2. Everything Must Go, which reached number 5. Kevin Carter, which reached number 9. And Australia, which reached number 7. But then it just keeps on going. And this is the most amazing thing about this album, this turning point, this crossroads for the band. 1997 Brit Awards, Best British Album, Best British Group, Q Magazine Album of the Year 1996. Wow. It just keeps on going. The band, reflecting several years later, looking back at the album, James, it was the only way we knew how to survive. We weren't trying to erase Richey, we were trying to honour him and live. Nicky, it was our Abbey Road moment, the weight of the past and the hope of the future in one record. Who could argue with that? Who could argue with that? Now, some people could have taken exception to the change in the sound, the change in the way that they were hearing the Manics perform, but that was to miss the point of the Manics. That the Manics grew, that as friends they grew and changed, as their musical influences changed, so did they. As their literary heroes changed, so did they. But there was always that core essence that they were the Manics. Irrespective of the pain they were going through, irrespective of the challenges that they faced, that they remained the Manics. And that's a wonderful thing. That shows that strength of friendship, that shows that strength of belief, that whilst you might sing nihilist songs and whilst you might follow the punk ethos, you know, it's not about not having belief. You know, even if you believe in nothing, it's still a belief. Now, if Richey didn't say that at some point, I'd be absolutely gobsmacked, but that's how it comes across to me. And I will always be grateful for that album, for what it did for me personally, but how it set the Manics up onto the next phase of their career. You know, we were reaching a time when the Manics may have started to have looked a little bit mainstream, and I'm sure there were fans out there, and I'm sure there were people that were concerned about that. You know, getting Brit Awards is a fairly mainstream affair. Winning NME Album of the Year awards is, you know, it's a mainstream affair, and the music slotted in more with the, dare I say, chart music at the time. But that was when you didn't listen to the lyrics. When we go back and listen to those lyrics of Design for Life, of the struggle of the working class, of using education, using pride to advance, that's where we see the Manics. That's where they live. They live in their words as much as they live in their music. And yes, they lost that focal point, that image of Richey up front. But then it became the three of them up front. And I personally think that allowed for more growth. Richey wasn't holding them back. But was Richey's direction the most attractive direction to allow the Manics to be what they truly deserve to be? And, you know, Richey's influence remains on the band even to this day. You know, it's very, very, very obviously there. You know, they're all in the 50s now. They're all, you know, suffering from dodgy knees and sore hands and don't drink as much as they used to. But every single time they go on the stage, there's still that space for Richey. There's still that nod in his direction. And that is not only true friendship, but that is exactly what a band should be about. But what did the band themselves think about this sudden change, this sudden success? James Dean Bradfield, in an interview with The Guardian, we didn't think people wanted to listen to us anymore, especially not without Richey. Nicky, it was like walking out of a coma and discovering we were in the top 5. Wow. They also talked about survivor's guilt, and that is something which is very, very common when one person goes and the other person doesn't, or one person goes and a group of people doesn't. So James, in the 1997 Brit Awards, thanks to everyone who stuck with us through the worst year of our lives. And Nicky, reflecting years later, it felt like cheating sometimes. The success was tainted, but we couldn't let it drown us. So as I've already said, the the loss of Richey meant the loss of that front person. James stepped into that role naturally. He, they moved away from the strict military style of the Holy Bible and became more accessible. Nicky, and Nicky was up there with Richey when it came to being spiky, possibly, is that the right way of putting it? But definitely flamboyant. Became more introspective in interviews. And Sean, always the quiet one. Didn't say much in interviews, but years later reflected that the live shows over that period were both therapeutic and terrifying. There was that transition point as well where the band had to learn how to play as a three-piece, and that meant through 96, 97, there was almost, they were an incredibly tight unit. They were and still are an insanely efficient band, and there's not a lot of wasted energy when they're playing. But Nicky said that the crowd were with us, and that was the greatest thing. They sang for Richey too. So the crowd became the fourth member. It's a bit like when you have a football match and the 12th man is the crowd, is egging everybody on. And I suppose the ultimate realisation for the band is that they could be everything that they'd set out to be, that they could still write anthemic music that was accessible, that they could retain their political and poetic edge, but at the same time they could still mourn and honour Richey, and it wasn't about being paralysed by the past, by being stuck there, by the only thing they can do to honour Richey is to just repeat, rinse, that growth was good. Thanks for joining me on this episode. I think I've said it quite a few times through this episode that Everything Must Go is an incredibly important album to the band, and to me, Design for Life is just about the most important song in my life for the way it helped me. And that is more than probably why I love the Manics as much as I do, that out of all the bands, and I do have quite wide range of taste of music, but of all the bands, they're the only band that have ever made me feel as though they were writing a song to save me. And that sounds terribly grand and posturing and something out of a B movie. And yes, there have been other songs by other bands that have gone, hey, are you writing that for me, or are you writing that to me? But the Manics are the only band that have ever written a song where somebody was trying to save me, and they did that, and I'll be eternally grateful to them for that. They don't know they did it. They had no intention of doing it when they wrote that song, but that song, that album, is one of the greatest albums ever released, in my opinion. And I know it's subjective, and I know that people have different opinions, and we welcome and we embrace different opinions, but these are just my thoughts, as valid, as genuine as you believe they are. They're just my thoughts. This album would allow them to start to interact with other acts, with other artists. We'd had Tracy Lords on Generation Terrorist, but it would allow them a much wider field of collaboration, which was healthy for the band. James Dean Bradfield in particularly, I'm not ignoring Sean or Nicky at all, but James Dean Bradfield is, in my opinion, one of the finest rock guitarists ever. And you can look at any continent, any genre of music, he is a player of a unique ability to play his emotion through his instrument. You might look at blues players like Stevie Ray Vaughan, for example, who had that ability to make a guitar sound like something from heaven, even though he was trying to strangle the thing. But James has a different ability, and he will always be to me a guitar god, as he is to a lot of the Manics fans. And it's interesting how he progresses from here, how his writing style and his playing style progresses from here. Gone are the days of he only uses the white Les Paul and chug, 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 chug. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. Okay, but we start to see much more nuanced playing, much more nuanced compositions, and a lot of that comes from the producers they worked with, but I think a lot of that comes from the maturity that came into their writing at that time. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Come back for episode 4. This is my truth, tell me yours. I look forward to talking to you all again. I don't know how to say that really, but please like, share, tell your friends, tell your loved ones that the podcast is here. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye bye.